Hey everybody, thanks for joining us here on 9 News Watch. I'm meteorologist Chris Bianchi, and earlier today I had the opportunity to speak with Colorado Assistant State Climatologist Dr. Becky Bolinger about some of the impacts of the Marshall Fire and perhaps what led up to the fire, and specifically some of the potential links between climate change and what we saw back on December the 30th when the Marshall Fire burned over 1,000 structures and damaged 100 plus more structures, obviously in parts of Boulder County. So again, I spoke with Dr. Becky Bolinger, Assistant Colorado State Climatologist, about some of those impacts between the Marshall Fire as well as climate change, and also what led up to it, and also a bit more about what we can expect for the rest of the winter and going into the spring. Here's my interview. So, well, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time here to discuss this. Obviously, not the very, very sad situation when we saw there in Louisville and in Superior with the Marshall Fire. But if you wouldn't mind by starting off climatologically, rehashing some of the conditions that were in place and what ultimately led to that fire, and also what led it to spread so quickly.
Yeah, so it all kind of started back in the spring where we had some very wet conditions. We had an epic snowstorm in March, and that kicked off a much wetter than average spring when we typically get a lot of moisture on the Front Range urban corridor. And we got even more than we would typically get in that March, April, May time period. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
I'm going to put on Do Not Disturb so you don't have any more random of those. Okay. So after the much wetter than average spring that we experienced on the Front Range urban corridor, we kind of went into a little bit of a dry pattern. We didn't really get the summer moisture that we would typically expect. We couldn't really keep up with average. We got to the fall and we ended up in this much warmer and drier than average pattern. And that really persisted into December, where we were seeing much warmer than average temperatures, much drier than average conditions. For some locations in the Denver area, it was the driest on record back to the beginning of June. For Boulder, it wasn't the record driest, but it was definitely ranked up there, very dry. So when you add in those very dry conditions on top of the wet conditions that we had in the spring, you had some nice grasses growing. When we got to the summer, it was very lush and green. And then all that extended dryness really dried out that vegetation and it made for some kindling for any wildfire that could possibly spark. And add on the temperature component, that's adding further stress to the vegetation. So any warm and dry day you had, you would add in that wind, and all you would need is one spark, and we would see an out of control wildfire. And unfortunately, we saw it over an area that had a maximum impact.
Historically speaking, Becky, where would you say that the conditions were back on December the 30th for the Marshall Fire? Was this perhaps based on what you've assessed amongst, if not the most extreme fire conditions we've had around the area? I know that may be hard to quantify, but
yeah,
around that area.
I would say that we had conditions that would be more similar to summer, late summer, and definitely very unusual for December in terms of just intensifying drought. We are used to drought in our state, and we have had an increasing frequency in droughts in the 21st century. But this one is unique in the sense that it was rapidly intensifying in the fall and into the early winter. And that's not usually how we see droughts evolve in our state. They typically start in the spring and intensify in the summer. So to see that level of intensity happening with the warmth and the dryness, and we're talking near record dry soils underneath, and near record high evaporative demand for this time of year. And there were components that I would say were unprecedented, combined with some components that were abnormal, and all of that combined together to make this one extreme event.
Absolutely. Now, what led? We've gone into detail now about the fact that the summer and the fall, the early winter, were unusually dry and warm. What led to that?
So, I mean, part of it is it's a natural variability of our state in that we do experience a lot of variability, and that includes a lot of times with drought conditions. However, when we are talking about climate change, we do know some things for certain, particularly for our region, is that we are seeing this very consistent warming occurring in the fall and into the winter. And that is probably one of our strongest warming signals with climate change, is in those fall and early winter months. On top of that, we also know that our area is going to be at higher risk for more frequent and more severe droughts. So would we have had this drought without climate change? It's possible, but climate change does make these droughts more likely to occur. And so once you add in that climate change component of more often than not, our falls will be warmer than average, and we are experiencing increasing frequency of droughts. When you combine those together, you are increasing the likelihood that we are going to have more wildfire events like this.
Can you explain in more detail how climate change leads to the increased frequency of drought? Because again, this may be for more of the layperson, but obviously you've got warmer temperatures, but how does that perhaps affect precipitation?
Yeah, it affects precipitation differently in so many different areas of the globe and the country. So we have some areas in the country that are experiencing wetter conditions and more floods because of climate change. But we do know that the Western United States and the Southwest are more vulnerable to increased frequency of droughts and dryness. And a lot of climate models have been predicting this for a while, where they've talked about wet areas will get wetter, dry areas will get drier. Part of it, I think, for our area is that when you are warming the temperatures, there's this common theme that warmer temperatures can hold more water vapor. And so the air should have more moisture in it because it's warmer. But just because it can hold more water vapor doesn't mean it will. And so if we're not really changing our sources of moisture that we're getting on those warmer days, and you have the same amount of moisture in that air, the air is going to be drier because it can hold more, but it's not. So it's drier. So you're automatically drying out the air. And there has been recent research out there stating that in the Southwest and the West in our region, that not only are we seeing warmer temperatures, but the air itself is drier, and we are seeing that trend. And so while our annual precipitation patterns aren't changing, we see a lot of variability in precipitation with wet years and dry years. We do know that overall our air is drier. And so what that is going to mean is that you're at that increased risk for drought when you have extended strings of days of those warmer than average temperatures and no precipitation.
Absolutely. I guess now in the more shorter term, what concern do you have? I mean, obviously we've gotten some recent snow, which has perhaps helped a little bit, has been a little bit cooler lately, although that's changing obviously this week a bit. I know, it's not so bad. I know you like the warm weather, but how concerned are you for the rest of the, I mean, I know there's some factors I'll go into it, but how concerned are you for those similar conditions to play out again later on this winter?
So we are going into a climatologically drier time of year for a lot of eastern Colorado, lower elevations east of the divide. December, January, February, these months, typically you get a quarter of an inch to half an inch of moisture in the entire month if you're lucky. It's not uncommon to have drier than average months or a whole string of very dry days. And we are also going into our climatologically windy season. And so it is normal to have a risk for fires in the plains and along the Front Range this time of year, just simply because it is drier and it is windier. So that is a risk that we have every winter. When you add on a drought on top of that, your risk is just that those wildfires can spread out of control more quickly. I have looked back at some of our past low elevation fires that we've seen in the winter months and going into the spring. And typically the most notable ones, the biggest ones, or the ones that had the most impact have coincided with drought conditions. And so I think that will be a concern. Obviously, areas where you have snow on the ground, that's a pretty limited risk. So areas that still have the snow on the ground right now are at pretty low risk going into the next couple of days. But where there is no snow on the ground, you can very quickly and easily dry out those grasses and soils and be back to a dangerous fire situation. So it's never a guarantee. And the worst part is we don't know where they're going to happen. But I would say we are not done with the risk for wildfires as we move through the winter and into the spring.
Okay, so unfortunately not perhaps done with the fire season or fire threat.
Yes, ask any fire expert in the state, and when is fire season in Colorado, and they will tell you from January through December. So there's always a risk somewhere. And one extra thing that I will say is that the predictive services that puts out their fire outlooks has shown that Southeast Colorado is at higher risk this winter and into the spring for larger wildfires.
Southeast Colorado in particular. With that in mind, it's probably a little early because it's been less than 2 weeks since the Marshall Fire. And as a climatologist, are there any lessons or any sort of big takeaways that you've had? And again, feel free to say no because it's a little bit early, but any initial takeaways from what we saw back on December 30th?
So my first gut feeling initial takeaway is this is part of what we can expect more often. We have a lot of population that really falls in that area of wildland urban interface. And I can look just west of my neighborhood and see large areas of grasslands. And when you have those hot, dry falls, we're going to see an increased risk of this. And so I think that this is something that is not just a complete fluke. And so I hope that it is something that we can plan for in the future for all these neighborhoods that are at a similar risk location to where Superior and Louisville are. And hopefully it's something that we can address and mitigate those risks going into the future, because I do think that with the droughts we've recently seen, with the warm anomalies we've recently seen, that this could be something that could be at risk of happening again.
Oh, well, certainly some good takeaways. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to this overall topic, but that was kind of my main list of questions for you.
I guess I'll just end on the good note that where the snowpack is now, we are in really good condition. And looking at the snowpack numbers, we could even have like below average snowpack for the rest of the season and still have a shot at ending with near average peaks. And that's going to be really important in mitigating the wildfire risk in our mountain forests in the summer, which is typically our peak for wildfire season is June. And if we continue with the snowpack that we've had, that could be good news at mitigating that risk for large wildfires in June.
That's awesome. There we go.
Yeah.
There's a good conclusion. That would, I mean, obviously it depends on the summer, right? But I mean, that's one really big takeaway, right? Is that because the Eastern Plains, almost our season tends to be more winter when it's windier and it can whip about, right?
Yeah, but then as soon as you move, once the snowpack melts, that's when you start getting into the risk for wildfires in our forests, in our higher elevations. So obviously, the longer you hold on to that snowpack, the better. And we typically know that when we get near to above average snowpack, our wildfire season isn't as bad. So
hopefully a good takeaway.
Hopefully it continues. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Becky. I appreciate it. I'm going to stop recording and